I want to bring this, I would kind of put everything you've talked about on pause for just a second, because I think there's kind of an elephant in the room, coronavirus. We're all working at home, doing all these things. How does that right now, how is that affecting, or might that affect, have any impact on the energy infrastructure, whether it's the electrical grid or moving oil and gas around through pipelines? Christy, you want to address that in just a fairly short answer, but because we talked about that all afternoon. But yeah, is there anything? What's the talk right now about what this whole pandemic is going to do when it comes to people not going to work? And some of those folks are there to ensure the reliability of things like pipelines and electrical grids.
Well, what we have heard from both the pipeline sector as well as from the Edison Electric Institute, which is the trade association for the investor-owned utilities, is that they are taking lots of precautions. They are taking care of their operational personnel, of course, very carefully in terms of limiting access of non-essential personnel to facilities. And they think that they can, weather this pretty well. One of the good things about everybody not going to work is that we do have a little bit less demand, although it's demand that is at homes instead of at office buildings during the day. So we have to be careful and pay attention to how the system is managing. But what we need to do is make sure that that the operations are set. And then the only limitation that they're currently concerned about is, the utilities in particular have an outstanding program of assisting each other in times of crisis. You've seen, I know that folks down in Houston saw utility teams from all over the country come down after the hurricanes in a couple of years ago, and so that may be limited because of limited limitations on travel. So I think from an operational perspective, we're okay on the infrastructure side, barring any unexpected emergencies, and we just don't know. I mean, this is a very odd time right now, and things like cybersecurity risks and other concerns don't disappear just because there's a coronavirus out there. So everybody has to be on their toes. But right now, the infrastructure is feeling that they're fairly well positioned, certainly compared to producers of oil and gas that are taking it totally on the chin right now.
And Ed and John, any thoughts on that?
I'll comment about the ERCOT market from our perspective. We will probably have less electricity demand potentially through the summer. But ERCOT issued a report approximately 10 days ago, which showed that because of the growth of wind and solar, coastal wind and solar, ERCOT was in a much better position as we approached summer 2020 than summer 2019 and the 2 years before. So from our perspective, we think, first of all, we think ERCOT is the best grid operator in the country. And we think that because of their expertise and their demonstrated ability to integrate variable renewable energy resources into the grid, that we should be okay. But I will hasten to add that during Secretary Perry's tenure at DOE, they released a study that showed that it is cost effective in Texas beyond any other source of electricity to reduce energy use through cost effective energy efficiency programs by approximately 18 to 20% over the next 10 years. And we believe that that course of action should be taken because it will reduce consumers' electricity bill, substantially reduce all kinds of emissions, and improve grid reliability.
And Ed, any thoughts on coronavirus and the energy infrastructure?
Sure. To follow up with John, when I was at DOE in 1980 at the Office of Conservation and Solar Energy, conservation pays for itself very rapidly. And so that's always been the case. The great challenge with ERCOT is because you have 40% of the capacity sitting on the sideline during any given year, any given time, even through the cycle, is you have to be able to count on that capacity coming online when it's required And there have been several major localized outages across ERCOT, Dallas in February of 2011, when ERCOT wound up having what they call euphemistically a load shedding period of time, when it's, we call it a blackout. If someone's not getting paid to keep a generator available to operate, it may not be there. It's like you're having your grandfather's car in the garage. You drive your Tesla back and forth, but hey, here comes a hurricane. We've got to get everybody out of town. Will grandpa's car start if I haven't started it in 10 months, 12 months? Will the tires be inflated? And that's one of the great challenges with the ERCOT construction. Coronavirus is not going to have too much of an impact there. We're going to see reduced demand over this period of time. The tremendous impact, of course, is in the collapsed GDP that we're facing in Texas right now. The lack of transportation, great, gasoline's less than $2 a gallon, but I can't go anywhere. There's no place for me to go. The lack of transportation consumption. The trade war knocked a huge amount off over this past year. The Port of New Orleans had 20% less export loadings, 25% less import loadings or unloadings. We've seen large parts of China shut down. And so that pushes back on the oil supply chain all the way to the wellhead, or as many folks are calling it, demand destruction right now. How long this lasts, in addition to having the Saudi price war on top of this, is anybody's guess. If the virus enforces less economic activity for the next 3 to 4 months, we're going to see some real economic hurt in the oil and gas industry across Texas. Is it an issue for everybody? Well, coronavirus shutting maybe as much as 5 to 10% off of GDP if it were to extend our home office for 6 months. This is going to be really quite devastating for that part of the industry.
Can you bring up the Russians? If we have more time, maybe we'll circle back to you and ask you if the Russians are having, think this is all just working out really, really well at the point that they've been able to start flooding the market and then have this thing happen to us. Let me get back to the kind of the topics at hand with infrastructure and the whole topic of what we're talking about here with some of these projects that Christy talked about earlier. Projects that have been held up. I was thinking of the one, here in Texas, running across the hill country. If you talk about building a highway for somebody, or maybe giving them a new subway station, new airport, improving their infrastructure, they love that. But talk about putting a pipeline through the hill country, and suddenly all these ranchers come out and say that's not such a great idea. What's the Trump administration's impact been on all this? I thought that was supposed to be, grease the process so that it would go, these things would go through quicker. Is that really what's happening? Because it seems like we're hearing about still a lot of projects being held up. Christy, if you want to take that, and whoever else.
I believe you're talking about the Permian Highway project, right?
The Permian Highway, yes.
Yes, the Permian Highway project. Well, interestingly enough, that one's not FERC jurisdictional, so we can't put that problem at the Fed's door. That is actually an issue with the how the the balance of equities is assessed in Texas. And landowners who believe two things: one, that they deserve more of a say in eminent domain proceedings, as well as concerns related to Endangered Species Act, which is a federal issue. So that is certainly some chemistry that we're seeing going on. And the Trump administration has sought not only to change how the National Environmental Policy Act regulations work in an effort to streamline that process for pipelines, as well as for highways and roads and barges and canals and a whole bunch of other stuff that is subject to NEPA. But it is also talked about revisiting some of the issues with the Endangered Species Act, which is critical to both producers and to pipeline sponsors. So it's and they're getting a lot of pushback, and I think, I definitely want to hear John's thoughts on this, because it's one thing to say, okay, let's streamline things so stuff can get done. There are renewable energy projects that would dearly benefit from the expansion of transmission to markets where the customers are located, when they are located where the resource is. And so traversing this need for speed in a certain way to get projects in and adopted and built is certainly, running headlong into, the stewardship obligations we have under existing and potentially future statutes. So it's a challenge, and it doesn't seem to be taking less time. The environmental community is becoming phenomenally more sophisticated. It is not an avalanche of postcards at FERC anymore. It is very targeted criticisms of the analysis that is presented to FERC, for example, or to the Fish and Wildlife Service, really testing and challenging the conclusions those agencies are making. And I think in the long run, that improves the permit in terms of its robustness on judicial review. But it takes more time and it takes more money. And as I mentioned, then the question is if you hold a project up for 5 years, then does the customer at the other end have buyer's remorse and decide they want to do something else?
And John, your thoughts on that?
Well, um, when I was at the State Environmental Agency a long time ago, I took the position that it was important that we have the resources to efficiently review permits as they came in. We put forth an effort and we eliminated permit backlogs that had existed for quite some time. And we were able to do that without compromising, from my perspective, environmental requirements. So I think, I can't speak of other states, but in Texas, there are fees that regulated entities are paying to underwrite the cost of, for example, the TCEQ staff. Unfortunately, the legislature has not appropriated all of those monies to the agency, and environmental reviews tend to take too long. I think that it's important, although I believe that environmental protection is important, I believe that it's also important to efficiently process things and to have the resources to make sure that appropriate reviews are being conducted, but we're making decisions timely.
And Ed, any thoughts on that, about how these projects that are so desperately needed and yet are facing this kind of opposition, what can the Trump administration effectively do to speed those things up, or is it doing that?
Well, in effect, they'd be pushing on a string. I don't know, but Krista, you can help me with this. If we have a full complement of FERC commissioners, for a while we didn't. And so FERC was kind of hamstrung by the lack of a quorum. The president came out 2.5, 3 weeks ago in favor of the Atlantic pipeline and talking about pushing it through. But really, we're not seeing a whole lot of action in that regard. They talked about bringing in the Keystone XL pipeline. Well, that hasn't yet come into operation or construction. The local pipelines here in Texas, it's remarkable that these have been held up just from, it runs counter to the can-do, get-it-done approach of Texas commercial interest and government. But the administration, hasn't been really actively against anything, and but the efforts that they've tried to expend and going forward really haven't been effective.
Well, I think that from the Trump administration's perspective, they have had a lot going on. And I would agree that some of the proposals, particularly on the modifications to the NEPA regulations, the National Environmental Policy Act regulations, were slower than a lot of folks expected, and they've only recently been proposed. So the comments just actually ended last week. So I think that, there is a bit of slowness compared to what a lot of folks in the energy industry expected. In terms of the FERC quorum, FERC currently has, well, it depends on how you count it. There has been a newly confirmed Republican commissioner who is yet to be sworn in. And when he is sworn in, they will have 4 until Bernie McNamee departs, as he is elected not to be renominated at the end of his term in June. So we will go back to having 2 Republican commissioners and 1 Democrat commissioner and 2 empty seats. And no party can have more than 3 commissioners at one time. Is that slowing the reviews down? Actually, FERC has had an outstanding record on judicial review for their permits under the National Environmental Policy Act. What has hamstrung Atlantic Coast Pipeline, which is going from the Marcellus down into the Carolinas and Virginia, has been the Forest Service and the Fish and Wildlife Service permits. So we've had some very talented lawyers on the environmental side find flaws in those permits, and they are pretty big. Constitution Pipeline, which is the one that is been shelved recently by Williams, that one is was going to head up to Wright, New York, and connect to pipelines further on into Boston to meet needs up there. That one's been shelved altogether, and that one fell apart over a state review over a Clean Water Act water quality permit. And so you have a lot of tension, and there's not, the EPA has proposed constraining the ability of states to use Clean Water Act Section 401 to veto their veto a FERC-approved pipeline, such as in the case of Constitution, but that hasn't been finalized yet either. So I think your criticism of the speed of the administration in adopting what they've articulated as their efforts to streamline is shared by many folks in the energy complex who are frustrated that these promised reforms, which they hope will assist future projects, will get done. And now that we're looking at this demand drop and an oversupply situation for the foreseeable future, it hasn't helped anybody who's stuck now. And, it is arguably a good time to push things forward, but we're getting close to an election, and that sort of gums up a little bit of everything.
Mm-hmm. Something Chrissy brought up was about greenhouse gas emissions. And this is a little bit different question, but should greenhouse gas emissions be considered in energy market prices? And if that's the case, what would be the best way to do that, to price in greenhouse gas emissions in market prices? Any thoughts on that from anybody on the panel?
Come on, Ed, you're my economist.
You got it. And so I've been in favor of greenhouse gas taxes on a per BTU basis, per ton basis. This would help accelerate the departure from coal-fired power plants. It would also help accelerate the departure from fuel oil in the Northeast. Again, just on price differentials right now, post-virus, I guess, we're a little closer to parity, but still, oil burns 30% more or produces more 30% pollutants and CO2 than natural gas does. And so in the Northeast, there's this entrenched infrastructure delivering fuel oil to everyone's home. One of the pipeline providers tells me that he's got 250,000 potential customers within a mile and a half of the termination in Fairfield County, Connecticut. And, this could help spur some economic development if we made that transition. Going ahead with a carbon tax, as some states have done, as the Northeast New England region has, as California has done, will help accelerate a transition to electric vehicles and to greater conservation. We're all in this together. It doesn't matter whether you're Republican or Democrat. The work by Tony Lasirowitz at the Yale Climate Communications group points out that 76% of all registered voters are in favor of doing something to reduce the emissions of greenhouse gases. That means it's a majority of Republicans and a majority of Democrats. And at some point, the voter needs to step up to it and get it done. Every elected politician, on the other hand, knows that if the price goes up at the pump or if the price goes up at the meter, they don't get reelected. And this is an election year.
And Ed, is that always in the case where you have the electorate that on one hand is saying we need to do things to reduce greenhouse gases and slow down climate change, and yet when you say let's do some of these infrastructure projects that would bring maybe more wind power across Texas, but you have to build the grid to do that, there's opposition. Is that one of the big challenges? Is just uh, to get the electorate to understand what is really necessary when it comes to making those changes that they say they advocate?
Well, absolutely. But the fabulous thing about Texas is we have built the grid to bring the wind energy to market, and so the ratepayer winds up paying for it because the voter, by way of the legislation, by way of the governor and the Public Utility Commission, have approved it. The ratepayer, aka voter, doesn't always see this happening, and so I consider it kind of a back door that we've been able to develop this feed-in tariff to accommodate the growth of wind energy in Texas, and we continue to do so. Building wind plants along the Gulf Coast, we're a lot closer to infrastructure. The cost of tapping into the transmission lines won't be as significant as it has been to bring that electricity from West Texas. Across the United States, there's a wonderful book out by Russell Gold on superpower, basically chronicling Mike Skelly of Houston in his effort to bring a power line, a major power line from wind producing regions to consumer regions, and the great difficulties that he had crossing state lines, crossing different legal authorities, and eventually shelving it because there was just no way people wanted this in their backyard.
What do you see as the biggest challenge for infrastructure in terms of trying to go 100% carbon free? What would be the number one thing on a 100% carbon free power grid that right now is the biggest challenge in trying to accomplish that? Anyone?
In Texas, I don't believe 100% carbon-free electricity market is feasible. When you look at the amount of electricity we have to have during summer to keep the lights on, while we may be able to accommodate coal going off the grid over the next 10 to 15 years. I mean, we recognize that in Texas, where load growth is growing 2% a year, that we will need natural gas in coming years. We would hasten to add, however, that we believe it's important for oil and gas companies to step up, as many are doing, to begin to reduce their methane emissions. And we've demonstrated through studies that that can be done in a very cost-effective manner. But from my perspective in Texas, as a strong proponent of clean energy, one of the worst things that could happen is for the lights to go off in summer. And I think that would forestall progress for a long time. And we recognize that as we shift from that natural gas generation, for example, emits approximately 50% less carbon emissions than coal. And most of that coal is transported to Texas from Wyoming. So but we are concerned that it is cost effective for methane emissions to be reduced today. And we hope that as we have major oil and gas companies stepping up to address that issue, we are hopeful that we will see more and more do that, or we have the adoption of policies, because that can be done in a very cost-effective manner. I think it's important. My hope is that supporters and producers of oil and gas will recognize that in this environment where there is almost universal agreement among scientists that the climate crisis is actually worse than they have been projecting, that it's important for these producers and supporters to realize that that if they want to ensure their long-term viability, it is imperative that they step up and reduce their methane emissions. And they would also benefit greatly if all of the cars in Texas major urban areas over the next 20 years were electrified. Because that would mean that much of the industrial base in Texas would be able to see less reductions in various emissions because of the significant progress that would have been made in the electricity and in the transportation sectors. I personally recognize that a strong industrial economy is a prerequisite for a consistently growing economy. And all of my training and all of my experience has led me to believe that we can get that done as we also protect the environment. Anyway, that's my perspective.
Yeah, and I just have to follow up with you, John, because you point out about the chance if the lights go out this summer. You talked earlier about wind power creating a bigger reserve margin, and that has increased somewhat. But it sounds like you still have concerns, though.
No. It's actually the growth of solar power.
Oh, solar is the one.
Solar is the resource that's really growing. And it is best when the temperature is 100 degrees plus. So we actually are in a position this year where the reserve margin is substantially better than it has been in the previous 3 years. And I would add that despite all of the predictions, we had no brownouts during the past 3 summers, and no blackouts. And I credit the expertise of the ERCOT people for doing that, and for them working with generators, all of the generators, to make sure that they did their maintenance work before summer, so that there was sufficient electricity to keep the lights on during our summer peaks. I think we're much better off today. I think we would be much better off for the next 3 to 4 years. And I recognize that West Texas wind is almost off the grid when we have 100-degree temperatures. But we did know something very interesting this past summer, and that is coastal wind starts coming on the grid around 1 o'clock in the afternoon and continues to grow through the evening up until about 9 o'clock. So as West Texas wind is going off the grid, solar is coming onto the grid, and coastal wind is coming onto the grid. No, we are optimistic that even before the potential downturn of the economy because of the coronavirus, that ERCOT is in a better position for summer 2020 than it has been for the previous 3 years. And during those previous 3 years, when the reserve margin was relatively tight, the lights stayed on.
Chris, do you want to comment there? Because I know there's, on both coasts, it seems like there's certainly a lot of problems with electric grids and how they're being managed. John is a big proponent of ERCOT. Who looks at ERCOT and says that is the way to be doing it? Can you duplicate that in other parts of the country, or does anyone necessarily want to duplicate that in other parts of the country?
Well, between you, me, and the light post,
Right.
I would not be in any hurry to adopt a capacity market in Texas, because it can be a little bit problematic, because it's not that a capacity market doesn't solve brilliantly for the price of power. It does. The problem is that the assumptions don't always hold from the year that you run the auction to the year that you start delivering the power. And when energy and ancillary services revenues don't wind up being as much as generators planned when they put their bids in for capacity, then what you have is lower returns than folks expected. And we have, for example, an overcapacity problem right now in PJM, which is the grid operator that serves the Mid-Atlantic, where they target a 16.5% reserve margin and they're running at about 28. And so there's a mismatch in terms of the generation that's available. There's a lot of it. Not all of it is as clean or as low emitting as many of the policymakers in the 14 states and parts of states that are part of PJM would like it to be. And we've got some pretty significant conflicts in that multi-state regional grouping in terms of what preferences are in terms of emissions profiles. And that's been very problematic. You have a different issue in New York, where they're almost have retired almost all of their coal-fired capability. They are a little tight on gas, but they have a governor who's very aggressive in pushing a transformation of that market. And that grid operator is trying to get the governor to get on board with the idea of putting a carbon price into their single state market. So New York has its own independent system operator. And so he's trying to get support for the idea of adopting a carbon price in New York. You look to the 6 states that are the members of the ISO New England, and even those folks who are not so far apart ideologically when it comes to issues on the environment, they haven't come together to decide on the best carbon mechanism to use in their markets. And that's a challenge for them. You go out to the West Coast, and you look at California, and California's had a huge challenge. They had a great uptake in community aggregation programs out there. And then the grid operator said, well, that's all well and good for energy guys, but I need you all to cover your capacity too. And so you've had a whole bunch of community aggregators go out and put folks together, and now they're being handed a bill for incremental capacity coverage and reliability that they don't expect, and is out of step with their business model. So it's a challenge because these markets are great in theory, but sometimes the amount of time it takes to get tariff changes done, to get stakeholders together, to get these things worked out, you wind up with things that get really, really sticky and dysfunctional that cause other problems. And that starts to erode the success of markets. And, I would say in some ways, ERCOT has been fortunate in 2 very big things. One, they're not jurisdictional to FERC. So they only have 1 regulator to contend with. And I can't imagine that hurts anything when you only have 1 audience to please and not 2. And then you also have the CREZ program that was a commitment by stakeholders to say, we're not going to worry about freeloaders under the FERC tariff and open access. We're going to build the asset, and then we're going to assume the wind is going to come. And that happened. Now, that's not the way it works in other parts of the country. There hasn't been that buy-in to build the transmission out first, and then let the, in that case, wind, come in, or community scale solar or utility scale solar come in and interconnect. It's been, someone who builds out to a project, and then he doesn't want the guy next door to jump on board. So you've got, things in Texas that are very, very fortunate. And the question of adopting a capacity market, it's great in theory, and it's great when the only thing you're worried about in price. PJM's market worked best when the only thing that mattered was the price. But now that we're talking about environmental attributes, policy preferences, deep decarbonization, different strategies from state to state, that mechanism is struggling mightily to accommodate those preferences. And so that's where we're seeing a lot of tension in the Mid-Atlantic and in the Northeast right now, is how to meet the desires of states that still have control over generation in a federal framework that is primarily designed to help facilitate transmission.
Ed, would you like to add something there? Because we're ready to start wrapping up, but what are your thoughts on this?
Well, sure. Is it technologically feasible to go carbon free? And it has been for decades, but the electorate has not wanted to go forward with a full fleet of nuclear power plants. In New York ISO, the legislature gave a bailout to the 2 upstate plants. I think it's $500 million. And certainly, that and imputed, implied, and outstanding cost that's been, the taxpayers have subsidized the ratepayers, if you will, to keep those plants open. They closed Indian Point. California, of course, has all sorts of challenges. Wyoming has a tremendous fleet of wind turbines. They're happy to sell electricity down to California by their power line every day. Looking ahead, would the synthetic photosynthesis that a number of scientists are working on, it works at the lab bench, it works on small models, There's an opportunity for this to go forward because the power would be generated by solar. This could be very intriguing, interesting, and make a full transition in the next 20 years if this works out, at least to a zero carbon cycle situation. It would certainly hasten the end of fossil fuels, at least in the industrialized nations. We can get there. The question is, who wants to make the upfront investment? And right now, no one seems to be willing to do that. And certainly with the current climate this year, I don't think we're going to see very much prior to the election.
Well, on that note too, of the world having changed so dramatically so quickly, what are your final thoughts as we wrap things up? We're just about out of time. We started out this discussion with the title, the topic of energy infrastructure, bottleneck or enabler. Go down the line again, Christy. What are your final thoughts on all this? And again, kind of taking into consideration what's on the minds of so many right now with the coronavirus and world challenges.
Well, I think it can be both, of course. I think our panel has certainly amply demonstrated that. I think when we look down the road at an economy that looks like it's going to be struggling for several months, if not longer, and down the barrel of an election, the question is going to be, where do we wind up? Do we wind up with a president that still has a very deregulatory posture? And I think that, we can still see a lot of tension. If we get a swing of the pendulum to a Democrat, then we're going to see a lot more greenhouse gases come back to central decision making. And while that may be uncomfortable for a lot of market participants, the question is could you get some visibility even with that constraint? So those are the big things we're looking at.
Oh, I'm sorry. There we go. John, your final thoughts.
Lots of things are happening in the electricity markets today. And for those of us who like predictability and stability, what's happening can be unsettling. But I'm a strong believer that technology innovation, sensible people staying in the game to make decisions, can drive us forward in a manner whereby we have the electricity we need and we make progress in reducing carbon emissions as well as other pollutants, because that's what the public is going to insist on. The challenge is to do that in such a way where we don't drive cost up in a significant manner. And I believe that's possible. I'm optimistic. I think the key is to recognize that changes are going to occur. And out of those changes, we need to have the political will to address the compelling public policy issues that need to be addressed, but recognize it's important that the lights stay on for consumers and businesses.
Very good. Ed, your final thoughts on this?
Certainly. With electricity markets, the advent of deregulation, which began in the late 80s and early 90s, came about because many folks had recognized that the vertically integrated market, which was designed to provide 99.999% reliability of delivery of electricity to the consumer, was really expensive. And so if you could get by with 99% reliability, maybe you could save some great magnitude. And so that's what each market has been living with as they've so-called deregulated over the last 25, 30 years. At this moment, we're reaching the point where legacy generation assets are aging beyond their operating life. We've seen the extension of some nuclear plants now to 80 years. Maybe we can continue to do that, but certainly the coal plants and a lot of the gas plants can't go that long. We're going to reach a point where reliability becomes such a problem that the consumer is going to have a tremendous decision to make. Am I going to build generation facilities for myself? Am I going to put in microgrids, like, for example, many of the industrial plants along the ship channel? Or are we going to go ahead and vote for an upgrade to the Texas grid, to the PJM grid, to the California grid? I'm not sure when we're going to get there. We will get there. The economics are just pointing towards an increased payment at some point in the future.
And let me add this real quickly. Self-generation, homeowners generating their own electricity in Texas is growing 60%. And I think that suggests that we're going to see dramatic growth of on-site generation at homes and businesses. And that generation will in large part be distributive solar. And that can be done in a cost-effective manner, depending on how it's financed. And I would say this, we do have an energy poverty issue in this state because we've got 3.7 million households who are paying more than 10% of their electricity, more than 10% of their income on electricity cost. And that's an issue that we need to begin to address in this state.
John Hall and Ed Hers and Christy Tezek, you've given us a lot of things to think about and some great information in which to frame our thoughts about all of this. So we thank you for having taken time. And I know it's tough right now to find time to do a lot of things because suddenly things have gotten busy and sometimes more challenging to do, like when we're trying to do things virtually instead of in person. So thanks to you all, and my thanks to the University of Houston Energy Symposium for inviting me to moderate this afternoon. It's been a lot of fun. I believe we're going to go back to Rama.